Dear students, welcome to yet another lecture of your preparatory module on English for your CLAT exam. In this particular lecture, we'll be discussing about types of passages and strategies for reading passages. Since you all know that in most of the exams of your UG law, which includes CLAT, LSAT, ILET, or any other exam, for your comprehension ability, most of the times, or rather all of the times, you are given a reading comprehension passage followed by some questions which are typically in MCQ format. To understand a passage in this case becomes extremely important. And that's why in this particular passage, we'll be talking about types of passage and we discuss some of the strategies for reading. The lecture outline would be as follows. We first discuss types of passages, examples of passages, and then how to understand fiction and non-fiction passages, strategies for reading that includes skimming, scanning, annotation, taking quick notes, and at last, approach to solving a passage. Let's begin. First, types of passages. The broad bifurcation that comes under the types of passages is fiction passages and non-fiction passages. Now, what are fiction passages? These are passages that are made up of stories written to entertain the reader. They often include illustrations, a setting, problem, and its solution. Generally, the fiction books that you read, most of the stories, narratives that you read, that's fiction. The second category, the second broad category is non-fiction passages. These includes the passages that are based on facts and real-world knowledge. They often include a contents page, glossary, index, diagrams, and labels. So most of the passages that are not fictional comes into non-fiction passages. Though there are other passages under these criteria as well that we are going to discuss in the coming slides. But the broad headings are fiction passages and non-fiction passages. Now, specifically, let's discuss some of the non-fiction or perhaps some of the other types of passages that could very well be categorized either under fiction passages or under non-fiction passages. These are narrative, a narrative passage, a story, an essay with a plot, characters, and setting. It's a most common type of passage in literature or any story that you hear, a narrative passage. A descriptive passage. Now, what's a descriptive passage? A passage that paints a vivid picture, that describes a scenery, or say a countryside, or a person, a place. That's a descriptive passage. We have then expository passages. Now, what's an expository passage? A passage that provides information or explains a concept. And then we have a persuasive passage. Now, what's a persuasive passage? A passage that aims to convince the reader of a specific viewpoint. Generally, most of the debatable topics, for example, any topic regarding any specific issue which want a person to either speak for or against. Now, for example, you've read a passage that convinces you specifically on why you should emphasize on investing in SIPs. Or rather, there is a particular passage that tells you about the dangers of internet banking. Now, again, when a passage or a paragraph is persuading you for or against something, that broadly comes under the category of persuasive passage. The next one is analytical passage. Now, analytical passage is a passage that uses a hypothetical chart or say graph, table, or data to assess students' analytical skills. Or perhaps an analysis of any particular issue is given on the basis of certain facts at hand. So this could be analytical passage. Now moving on, informative. Now what is an informative passage? A non-fiction fact-based essay that delivers content to the reader in a straightforward manner. For example, a cooking book. Does this have any parts of fiction? No, it's only read the content in a picture, in a cooking book, or say in any book that instructs you to use a machine. The content there is specifically given to instruct you on something. So what is that? That is an informative passage. Okay. Literary passage basically is an an excerpt from a book, be it poetry or fiction. That's a literary passage. You can, in your examination, find passages based on natural sciences, social sciences. Okay, for example, a passage about something that sounds like a science class, such as geology, physics, astronomy, or zoology. Okay, or perhaps say social sciences, that is a passage drawn from a variety of disciplines, including anthropology, archaeology, economics, education, geography, history, linguistics, political science, population, health, psychology, and sociology. Okay, so varied topics that can be a passage on social sciences. And eventually, we have a passage that imparts information to the reader in a logical and objective manner, along with some facts and figures, is known as a factual passage. Okay, examples includes news stories, instructional manuals, research papers, and reports. In the previous example, I've told about informative passage. So factual passage are more or less the same, with a bit more focus on some facts. Now, let's discuss some of the examples of these passages. Now, for example, I want you all to please read this passage with me, or you can pause the screen for a moment and read this passage. Now, why students should eat breakfast every day? The first reason why you should eat breakfast before going to school is for your health. When you skip breakfast and go to school, you are looking for a disease because it's not healthy to have an empty stomach all day long. It's very important to have a meal and not let your stomach work empty. All you're going to get is gastritis and a lot of problems with your health if you don't eat breakfast. Another reason for eating breakfast is because you need food to do well in your classes. Your body and your brain are not going to function as good as they could because they have no energy and no strength. When you try to learn something and have nothing in your stomach, you're going to have a lot of trouble succeeding. A lot of people think that they should not eat because they are going to feel tired, but that's not true. Breakfast is not a very big meal. And on the contrary, you're going to feel tired if you don't have breakfast because you have spent the entire previous night without food. Now, I have a question for all of you. Which type of passage do you think it is? Think for a moment. Now, here's your answer. Now, this is an example of a persuasive passage. Remember what I told you, a particular passage that convinces you for or against something. Now, this passage is persuading students for a cause. Now, what is that cause? The cause is to eat breakfast every day. It is arguing that why it is important for the students to eat breakfast by presenting arguments in a coherent manner. So just a small example of a persuasive passage. Now let's look about quickly a couple of more examples and then we move ahead with the class. A friendly clown. Now the title of this particular passage is A Friendly Clown. Let me read this for you. On one corner of my dresser sits a smiling toy clown on a tiny unicycle, a gift I received last Christmas from a close friend. The clown's short yellow hair, made of yarn, covers its ear but is parted above the eyes. The blue eyes are outlined in black with thin, dark lashes flowing from the brows. It has cherry red cheeks, nose, and lips, and its broad grin disappears into the white ruffle around its neck. The clown wears a fluffy two-tone nylon costume. The left side of the outfit is light blue and the right one is red. The two colors merge in a dark line that runs down the center of the small outfit. Surrounding its ankles and disguising its long black shoes are big pink bows. The white spokes on the wheels of the unicycle gather in the center and expand to the black tire so that the wheel somewhat resembles the inner half of a grapefruit. The clown and unicycle together stand about a foot high. As a cherished gift from my good friend Tran, this colorful figure greets me with a smile every time I enter my room. Now you have to use your own understanding and guess which kind of paragraph is it. Now the answer is this is an example of descriptive passage. By reading this passage, one can make an image of the clown as in the facial features, the color of its hair and outfits, clothes it is wearing, its height, etc. The passage is giving a complete picture of the clowns and hence is an example of a descriptive passage. Moving on to the last example. Very quickly give it a read. Either you can read it with me or you can pause the video for a moment and give it a read and then guess which kind of passage you think it is. My first Japanese pastry. Japan is known as the land of the rising sun. Ever since I was a child, I always thought of Japan as an exotic country filled with many strange and interesting customs. I had always wanted to travel to Japan and experience its old and ancient culture. Luckily, it was my first year in university and I was able to study abroad in Japan. I was so excited, but little did I know that I was about to learn an important lesson because of a simple pastry. At first, everything was new and exciting for me. Getting off the airplane from the London and walking the streets of Tokyo for the first time was very exciting. Seeing old temples, shrines, and some people dressed in kimonos was exciting and it fit my image of Japan exactly. I thought to myself, my dream has come true. However, after a while, a new buildings, the modern public transportation systems, and the modern department stores with all the signs in English made me feel at home. I thought, basically, Japan is like the UK. Walking around, I started to feel hungry. I started looking for something cheap and delicious. I didn't know where I was, so I followed my nose and found a bakery. There were many breads and pastries everywhere. I really felt like I was back home. Suddenly, I spotted a delicious looking strawberry jam pastry. After I paid, I bit into the pastry. What is this? I thought. I was surprised to find that it was not filled with strawberry jam. It was filled with sweet bean paste called anko in Japan. It was such a disappointment. Although I didn't like sweet bean pastry that day, I have since learned to love it. What I learned was that many things look the same in Japan as in my country. However, on the contrary, they are pure Japanese and they should be appreciated for what they are. Now, traveling is more enjoyable since I learned this lesson. Now, students, you have to guess what exactly the category, under which category does this passage falls. Now, this is an example of narrative passage. Okay. For example, this particular passage has a plot, a character, since it is narrated in the first person, I, the speaker, is the character, and a setting, that is the life in Japan. And it's the most common type of passage, and this passage tells us a story or a narrative. And when you look at the narrative passages, it is very important for you to observe. One most important thing that all of you need to learn is that for most of the narrative passages, in fact, for any kind of passages that comes in the examinations or that are written, there is a flow of thought that is pre-decided, and every passage follows that flow of thought. Okay, for example, if you see the outline of this narrative passage, you see very clearly I have bifurcated all these lines, all these sentences into different colors. If you take a look at them very carefully, you'll understand that there are many colors. Now let me take you to the next slide to tell you what exactly does this color symbolize and what exactly is the bifurcation of thought, okay, in this entire passage. Now see, now this entire essay can be divided into three parts: intro, body, and conclusion. In intro, we first have hook. Hook basically means the first line, the introductory line of any video or any paragraph. So the hook is Japan is known as the land of rising sun. Then the background. Okay, what you've already thought of it. That is, I always thought Japan was an exotic country with interesting customs. I always wanted to go to Japan. Okay. Thesis. The main point is that eating a pastry in Japan taught me an important lesson. Now, let's come to body, which has situation, a particular circumstance, a rising action, and a climax. Now, the situation is getting off the airplane and walking the streets of Tokyo, Japan was very exciting, but it also feels same as home. Now, here comes the rising action. I was hungry and I wanted something cheap and delicious. I found a bakery. I saw a strawberry jam pastry like back home. Now the speaker in this scenario is building up the entire action. Okay, that what exactly made him do, that he found a lesson. Here it is, he wanted to get something cheap and delicious. Now the climax is, I bit into the pastry and was surprised to find it was not strawberry jam. Okay, that's the final sequence, that's the climax. Okay, and after that we come to the next part, that is the conclusion. That is, I began to light sweet bean paste. I learned that many things in Japan look the same as in the UK, but they are truly Japanese and we should appreciate them. And finally the conclusion is, now traveling is more enjoyable. So broadly, this was the structure of the entire passage. Now, this happens to be quite an easy passage. Such structurization would help you understand the complex passages so that you can very clearly bifurcate that what's the hook, the background, and then the thesis, and then the situation, rising action, climax. Rising action and climax happens to be extremely important. They give you hint to many important inferences and eventually the conclusion. Now let's move to the next part of our discussion. Since we've discussed about fiction passages and non-fiction passages, now how to understand fiction and non-fiction passages. Now, when it comes to fiction passages, there are various elements that we need to focus on. However, the chances of you getting a fiction passage in your examination are quite less. The chances of getting a non-fiction passage is more. That said, I'm not saying that you will not get a fiction passage, but the chances of you getting a non-fiction passage is more. Now, what elements are we supposed to focus on in fiction passages? First, plot. That is, what is happening in the story. If we go by the last passage, okay, a visitor, okay, was roaming around in the streets of Tokyo. Characters, the last passage was spoken in the first person narrative, so the first person, I, was the character, the speaker. How do they develop? In fact, their understanding about traveling, their understanding about cross-cultural nuances developed according to the happenings in the passage. Setting and tone, when and where does it take place? What is the tone? So when and where does it take place? So from what we know from the last example, a British went to Japan Okay, and it happened in the streets of Tokyo. Now, what is the tone? Now, the tone in this sense is more of interpretive. Okay, now the person in retrospect is looking at a scenario that had taught him something. Okay, so that's the tone, theme, and symbols. Now, what is the underlying message or symbolism? So what was the underlying message? That things may look similar but not actually be similar, and the symbolism was of pastry. Okay, so pastry as a symbol symbolizes something more than a pastry. That is, in Japan, many things might look like they are same as those things that appear to be in the UK, but in general, the taste might differ, or perhaps their entire nature might differ. Okay, there has to be a sense of being Japanese. They'll have a essence of Japan. Okay, since they are there in Japan, they might look like prima facie, they might look like something similar that is found in the UK, but in reality they might not be the same. Now that's how to understand fiction passages. Moving on, how to understand non-fiction passages. Now, what elements do we focus on? Okay, first of all, in the non-fiction passages, we first focus on main argument and thesis. That is, what is the author's main point? What exactly is the point the author is trying to make? Supporting details. What evidence supports the main argument? Okay, first there has to be a thesis, and then there has to be an argument, a particular fact or a particular scenario that supports, okay, a rationale that supports the argument, that supports the basic thesis that you've made. Now, the third is, how is the argument organized? If the passage is persuasive, or if a passage perhaps has an open-ended closure, or perhaps if a passage is giving two sides of some particular scenario and is wanting you, the reader, to analyze, their understanding the structure of the argument becomes extremely crucial. Okay, and then the tone of the author. The tone of the author in non-fiction passages is extremely important because it sets the tone of the argument. I might be writing for a neutral passage on, say, capital punishment, but if my tone is such that the arguments that I have presented against the capital punishment are sounding to be more emphatic, okay, the reader will understand that I am more tilted towards abolition, okay, abolishing the capital punishment. So, author's tone, is it objective, persuasive, or informative? Now, moving on, strategies. Now, students, specifically for CLAT, in the English section of UG CLAT, students will be provided passages of about 450 words each. These passages, like this information is given in the website of CLAT, these passages will be derived from contemporary or historically significant fiction and non-fiction writing, and would be of a standard that a 12th standard student may be able to read in 5 to 7 minutes. Again, in other exams like IELTS, LSAT, SNAP, there is no such word limit. So there could be passages that are even bigger and has less marks, or perhaps even shorter. However, for CLAT, the word limit, the approximate word limit is given. Now, let's discuss about some of the strategies. Now, since we all know that in every exam, there will be minimum to 5 to 7 passages that you have to cover, there has to be certain strategies that you know that will make your reading a bit effective. Moving on, what could be those strategies? So we have some fixed strategies that we are going to discuss here. Now, what are the key techniques? Key techniques includes skimming, scanning, annotation, and taking quick notes. Now let's quickly see what these all strategies encompass. First, skimming. What is skimming? Sorry. Skimming basically means reading the passage quickly to get a general idea of the content. How do we skim? We focus on titles, subheadings, and the first and the last sentences of each paragraph. Look for keywords and main ideas without reading every word. For example, you are reading about World War II. There's a passage that comes, and the heading is World War II. Now you are focusing on, you are skimming. Skimming means you are very quickly just taking a cursory look at the entire passage, and you're figuring out that what are the main titles there, what are the subheadings, if the passage is in different paragraphs, what do these paragraphs talk about, what are the main words. Often you focus on first and the last sentences because they in general lead you to understand the tone and the conclusion of what's given in the passage. The first sentence generally sets the tone of the discussion, whereas the last sentence or last 2-3 sentences in general concludes. Now, when to use skimming? To understand the main topic and flow of the passage before diving into any details. So this process is known as skimming. Next is scanning. Now, what is scanning? Scanning is quickly looking through the text to find any specific information. For example, you've read a question and you are finding, you want to find, say, something on the aftermath of World War II, something that had happened in the year 1945. So now you have a keyword 1945. Now you go back now to the entire passage and you see where is the year 1945 given, and wherever the word, or in fact that number 1945, the year 1945 is given, you can assume that your answer lies somewhere there. Okay, how to scan? Identify keywords relevant to the question. Move your eyes rapidly over the text until you locate these keywords. Okay, and when to use? When looking for answers to specific questions. So that is known as scanning. Now, often students are confused, between skimming and scanning. So there's a difference between skimming and scanning. Skimming is reading rapidly in order to get a general overview of the material. Scanning is reading rapidly in order to find specific facts. While skimming tells you what general information is within a section, scanning helps you locate a particular fact. You skim the entire paragraph as a whole while you scan the paragraph when you are searching for the answer to the specific question. Now, again, like I said, first when you get the paragraph, you just have to skim it thoroughly, or perhaps skim it with a cursory look, as in to get an idea of what I'm getting into. Okay, for example, you've skimmed and you'll understand that this particular passage talks about virtual reality and some of the possible disadvantages or perhaps threats from virtual reality that we might face. Okay, however, when you scan, you look for any specific information. And both of these strategies comes in very handy, specifically when you try to figure out the details of a reading comprehension question within a specified time frame. Taking notes. The next technique that we are going to discuss is taking notes. Now, what's the purpose of taking notes? To organize information and ideas as you read. See, students, practically it is not possible for you, or for anyone for that matter, to remember each and every minute detail given in the paragraph. Now, since it's humanly not possible, what you need to do? You need to take notes while you read the passage. Now, to organize information and ideas as you read, that's the purpose of taking notes. Now, how to take notes? Write briefly in the margins or on a separate paper. Summarize main ideas and key details. Now, when I say summarize main ideas and key details, at times the entire passage could possibly be divided into 3 or 4 or say 5 different paragraphs. So on a standard note, 3 different paragraphs. Now, writing the key details of all the different paragraphs will also help you understand the flow of idea, the flow of thought. Okay, and create a map of the passage for quick reference, as in which paragraph talks about what, which particular idea or perhaps which particular argument is for or which is against. This particularly helps. and when to use while practicing or reviewing passages to understand the structure. Moving on, now we have annotation. Most of you might very well be knowing what annotation is and why it is used. We use annotation, okay, to highlight the main ideas or issues. However, it's not the only thing that annotation is used. Okay, now how to annotate? First, what we do, we mark or highlight the main ideas, and then marking unfamiliar vocabulary. At times, not at times, very often, you will find questions on vocabularies that will expect you to understand the meanings of the words in a contextual manner or to understand the meanings of phrasal verbs. Okay, so understanding the meaning of words that are relatively unknown to you, or perhaps understanding the meaning of phrasal verbs, becomes extremely important. So annotation helps you to mark these words that are hitherto unknown to you. If you know the meaning of a word, then any kind of question on that particular word can easily be answered. However, problem comes when you don't know the exact meaning to a word. So when you don't know the exact meaning of a word, you might well be able to underline it, and eventually from the argument given, you can figure out the contextual meaning and figuring out the rhetorical devices. Now, what are rhetorical devices? Rhetorical devices are figures of speech. They are figures of speech that are there to enhance or to emphasize your argument. You might have read about a lot of figures of speech like simile, metaphor, synecdoche, alliteration. So there are many figures of speech. Why do we use figures of speech? We use figures of speech to either give a comic effect or to at times emphasize what we are trying to say. Okay, in most of the speeches you might have heard, most of the impressive speeches you might have heard, people are using sentences in a way where, you know, they create a particular sound effect. For example, a famous example of alliteration, that is the repetition of same consonant sound, that I can remember is Betty bought some butter, but the butter was bitter, so she bought some more butter to make the bitter butter better. So this has a rhetorical device which is known as alliteration. So many such rhetorical devices. So we can figure out some of the rhetorical devices. So these are all the works of annotation and when to use while reading the passage to figure out the main elements for later references. So when you read a passage that has a lot of back and forth discussion, a lot of facts that you might need to answer a question that follows, annotation happens to be extremely important. Now, from the exam point of view, how do we approach? Now, approach for CLAT passages should ideally be skim the passage for a general understanding. The first part is always skimming the main passage for the general understanding. Then you, in the second read, you annotate key points. Especially for complex arguments, you annotate key points. For example, one argument is given for the motion, the other argument is given against the motion, or perhaps one argument is given in which one key date is given and what happened in that key date, that particular thing is given. Or particularly you come across a word that is extremely long, so you understand that there might be questions on this particular word, or say one particular phrasal verb that is used very often in different contexts. So you annotate, you underline that phrasal verb so that you can figure out the meaning of that later. Now, after you annotate, you take quick notes if needed for recall or clarity. Perhaps if you think that there are certain questions that might be asked. Basically, ideally, the scenario is that when you skim the passage, you also skim the questions so that you have a rough idea of what kind of questions were asked. If there are more inference-based questions, then annotation would be extremely important. If there are more direct questions, then scanning would be extremely important. So how do we go about it? We first skim the passage, then we have a detailed reading where we annotate and take quick notes. And then after developing an understanding, we go to the question, and to find the specific answers, we start scanning. That's the way to go. You skim, you annotate, you take quick notes, and then you scan. Now, in the classes to come, we'll have a practice of these approaches. As of now, I'll end this particular lecture. I hope you have enjoyed this particular lecture. Thank you so very much.